Hello friends, good afternoon and welcome to EduSat Live Lectures. Dear friends, as you know that we have started a series on religion, society and culture in Indian history, and today we are conducting yet another lecture in the same series. In today's lecture, we will try and understand renunciatory traditions in early India as well as Buddhism and Jainism in early India, a comparative study. To discuss this topic, we have with us our subject expert, Mr. Saurabh Kumar. Mr. Kumar is a gold medalist in Masters in History. He has also been awarded Teaching Excellence Award by Vice Chancellor, University of Delhi. Mr. Kumar has been associated with University of Delhi in various teaching capacities for past 4 years. Without further ado, I would like to welcome Sir to our studios and request him to start the lecture. Welcome, Sir.
Hello friends, I am Saurabh, as already told to you. Today I will be discussing the renunciatory traditions in early Indian history, a brief overview about the things. So I think let's begin with the topic. Now we all know renunciation. What does renunciation really mean? And in different capacities we have heard the term. So let's see how renunciation was looked at in the Indian traditions. We normally feel that we have a great past, we have a thousands of years old historical tradition of culture and civilization. But renunciation doesn't find mention easily. The moment we take the name of renunciation, we feel it's something like quite special, quite different, not according to the norms of the society. So today after this lecture or during the course of this lecture, we'll try to look at these different aspects of social history of renunciation. Historical realities are far more complex than what they really appear to be. So as far as renunciation is concerned, the sources were also quite diverse and quite different in their own way. Sources are of various categories and genres. The primary sources, for example, which discuss renunciation, they are basically related to Buddhist, Jain and Brahmanical religious traditions. As far as secondary literature are concerned, they were written at times, in different capacities, sometimes by royalty, sometimes by other laymen, and they passingly refer to the renunciatory traditions. For example, we can discuss Mat Vilas Prahasan by Mahendravarman, who was the Pallav ruler, and at times he becomes satirical when it comes to renunciatory traditions. Neither material philosophy nor dissent were wholly marginal to Indian society. So when we talk of Indian society, we have got different parameters of looking at it. We have different historiographical traditions. We find that colonialist historians looked at it from different angles. On one point, they had to legitimize their rule in India. On the other hand, they were the ones who brought Indian history to light. So there are different ways or different styles. For example, romanticization of Indian past. Then we have writings of Max Muller, who brought Indian spirituality to light. Now, the second historiographical tradition was nationalistic, where they tried to overemphasize the spiritual lookout of ancient Indians. So today in this discussion, we'll neither be limited to these historiographical traditions, we'll try to look at something which is quite different from what these people have already talked about. Amongst the recent historians, we find that Professor Romila Thapar, Professor R.S. Sharma, then are those people who have actually tried to bring in ancient Indian history into light, and they have made or popularized Indian history amongst the masses of this country. So it would seem self-evident that any society which is complex and has got diversities should have diverse aspects in its history as well. And in the same light, renunciation should also be seen. It has been the case with Indian society that it is quite complex, registers change, and then in the same manner it must also register ideas of dissent, protest and non-conformity. Otherwise, the very fact of change would be nullified. Renunciatory traditions of India. Opting out of society was through various types of renunciation, but not all of these can be seen as protest. Generally, we feel that the renouncers have protested against the social norms. That's why they have chosen the path of renunciation. But as we all know that we can renounce anything and everything of this life. Sometimes the renunciation comes out of wrath, anger, sometimes out of choice, or sometimes out of compulsion. Have we not come across incidents in our life where we find that, okay, from today onwards, we'll not look at chocolates or sweets. So that is a renunciation out of choice or at time or out of compulsion due to our health, medical health and all. Similarly, in past we find that kings renounced thrones. So normally speaking, we can say that it was by choice. But when we go into the deeper aspects, we find that sometimes they would have been advised to do so. In Mahabharata itself, we have got hundreds of examples where people renounced so many things. Bhishma, Pandu, so many people can be talked of. But in the same story, in the same narrative, we find people who don't want to compromise at all, which finally led to a great war. Now, instead of divulging into greater details of Mahabharata as a historical narrative, let's again come back to our discussion. We find that there were attempts at seeking individual salvation through renunciation and therefore other worldly orientations as well. One of the paradoxes of Indian tradition is that the renouncer, in spite of migrating out of society, remains a symbol of authority within the society. This idea of a renouncer being a symbol of authority is quite interesting. So we should try to focus how authority or power comes through renunciation. Analysis of the social role of the renouncer brings out the explanation of this paradox. There are certain questions related to renunciation. Renunciation versus asceticism. So first let's discuss what asceticism is or what renunciation means in context of asceticism. Ascetics are people who loosely may be termed as sadhus or people who have given up the folds of life or the social bondings. While renunciation can be like you're renunciating partly or completely. It depends what's the objective of the renunciation. Then loneliness versus social leadership. An ascetic is more or less associated with a lonely life. Similarly, a renunciant or a renouncer can be associated with loneliness. But at the same time, a renouncer can also have the social responsibility of leading the society by putting up a good example of himself. Then search versus attainment. When we start looking for something, some ideas, some thoughts, Gautam Buddha, for example, who was trying to search the realities of life, the truth of this life. So there we can find a conflict or a diversity between search and attainment, how search leads to renunciation and how attainment can also lead to renunciation. We may even come across evidences where we'll find that people after attaining everything feel that now they should renounce the world. They have done everything. Ashok, for example, after the Kaling war, renounces warfare, but he doesn't become a monk. He continues to rule, but as a renouncer, a person who has renounced warfare. So here this example of contentment comes up. Then we find quest versus satisfaction, question versus argument, dissent versus alternative. When we talk of quest versus satisfaction, quite interesting things emerge where we find that people who have a question, people who want to look for something, they would be renouncing the other things which are not connected with their quest. Similarly, people who are satisfied with their query, they would be renouncing the other things which they feel that they are not at all relevant after this satisfaction. Similarly, when we talk of dissent versus alternative, when we express dissent, then also we renounce the things which are causing that dissent. Similarly, when we have an alternative, then also we feel that yes, these alternatives can provide new guidelines, and then also we have a choice of renunciation. Diversity versus uniformity, and similarly conformity versus conformity. Please pay special attention to the spellings there. Conformity is that in conformation, and then conformity says that in conformation to the social laws. So on one hand, the person would either be conforming what the society wants him to conform, him or her to conform, while on the other, the word conformity can be looked as an aspect where the person is trying to act in confirmation of what the social norms or practices have been prevalent. Similarly, we have individuality versus pluralistic, and all these approaches really talk of renunciatory traditions. Now, renunciation, it's a tradition in itself. So before we proceed with this section, I would like to ask that, are we really aware of the diversities or different renunciatory traditions in Indian history? When we talk of renunciation, the term sannyas comes into our mind, and a sannyasi is often placed at the last leg of the fourfold ashram system. But if we think further, we find that Jain and Buddhist traditions were also somewhere closer to renunciation. Similarly, we can talk of Ajivik sects. But after all these broad headings, we find that there were many more philosophers who had actually renounced the world, or who had tried to give a dissent on different social aspects in their own diverse ways. Acquisition of knowledge requires a distance from society, and this tradition in itself is a rejection of conformity. This non-conformity was generally expressed through renunciation and migration to the forest. Here I would like to say that knowledge is a diverse concept. We cannot have a single unilateral definition of the term, and in the process of acquiring knowledge, it was generally subscribed or prescribed for people to make a distance from the society. When we talk of the fourfold division of society, when we talk of the ashram system where the entire life of a person was divided into 4 different stages, we find that brahmacharya, which was the first stage and was generally associated with the acquisition of knowledge, was generally practiced in a forest, away from a settled land, away from settlements, away from family, and that time was utilized for acquiring knowledge. So here we can connect that a person is renouncing his material life partially, not completely, and just for a short period of time, so that the person can acquire knowledge. Similarly, we find that among the more central aspects of religion in India, it is the unusual and paradoxical presence of the renouncer, not just as a marginal feature, but as a person of considerable authority. A renouncer who has renounced life for a short period, say for example a brahmachari, after the completion of the phase of brahmacharya was welcomed to the home and was duly married. Then he enters the phase of grihastha form of life, and after that vanaprastha life. So during the grihastha form of life, we find that the phase of renunciation comes to an end. That renunciation was obviously partial, not complete renunciation, but the level of authority the person has is according to his contemporary social status. But if the person becomes a permanent renouncer, the social status the person enjoys is certainly different from the one the person in a grihastha ashram enjoys. Both are 2 different aspects. So for the time being, let's keep this in mind and then proceed further with it. The renouncer within and without society. This is something which must be of interest to each one of us, that how the society perceived the renouncer, or how the renouncer perceives the society. We'll feel that at times society feels that renouncer is something quite different from its own norms and ethics. Sometimes they take the renouncer as a challenge. Sometimes the renouncer can become the leader of the society. Similarly, when we look at the perspectives of the renouncer, we find that renouncer may try to attach himself to the society, whether directly or indirectly, but as far as social norms are concerned, the renouncer will have no connections with the society. So in the early period, the renouncer emerges with the coming of sects such as the Buddhists and the Jains, which in turn are tied to some of the departures from Vedic ritual as registered in the major Upanishads. It's quite interesting to note that the Upanishadic philosophy became the background for Buddhism, Jainism and other ideas. Now, people who have a knowledge of the Vedic corpus of literature, we find that there were 4 Vedas, then came the phase of Vedangas, and in between we had Brahmanas, Aranyakas and Upanishads. So when we go by the genres of these literary traditions, we find that people after some time required explanations for the Vedic literature, and this gave birth to the different Brahmanas, with Upanishads, Aranyakas, etc. So in short, we can say that Upanishads, which basically deal with the philosophical aspects of contemporary society, should be taken as a mark of dissent, as a mark of protest against the established norms, or rather the tradition of questioning, the argumentation traditions which ancient Indians are actually known about. Then we find that the renouncer becomes important as the counterpoint to the insistence in other texts on social obligations and also to the limits of political power. That the renouncer has an authority in society reflects on the centrality of the individual, and renunciation becomes the assertion of the individual even in a social context. The most important aspect of the social role of the renouncer is the relationship between the renouncer and the lay community. There are certain theoretical aspects associated with renunciation. That the theory of the 4 ashramas function to some extent as a safety valve would seem evident from the placing of sannyas in old age after the completion of social obligations, as I have already discussed. Upanishads and Aranyakas are largely concerned with asceticism. Asceticism can be a nostalgia for the nomadic lifestyle which people had hundreds of years before settled agriculture came into limelight. Asceticism can be seen as a challenge to authoritarianism, which king or state societies brought into the nomadic societies. Asceticism can be seen as a disapproval of settled agricultural settlements. So in all these three concepts, we can look into the cultural aspects of society. As we are all aware that there were hunter-gatherer societies during Stone Ages, which gradually moved towards settled agricultural societies. Then finally surplus comes up, metal technologies and different aspects give birth to state societies. This development of state society and this transition of economic and social institutions is actually being talked about here. So we find that renunciation or asceticism on one hand can be seen as a challenge to the growing authoritarianism in the society. Say for example, when states come up during the 6th century BCE, the different Mahajanpadas, then we find that the renunciatory traditions become quite strong. So here I am trying to emphasize or trying to bring out the aspect that yes, when the state comes up, when the state starts asserting its rules, regulations, when a king-like body comes up, then people or society as a whole tries to assert its older ideas through renunciation. Similarly, when we find that agriculture becomes prominent, large-scale population is actively involved in agriculture, then in order to show something diverse, something different, something where agriculture did not exist, people protest, and this protest finds manifestation through renunciation, where the mendicants actually do not get engaged in agriculture, they still survive through begging, through alms, etc. And the third aspect, nostalgia for the nomadic past. Now this is something which is quite interesting. Before having settlements, permanent settlements, people were moving from place to place in search of food and shelter. Similarly, ascetic life or a nomad's life or a renunciant's life can be seen. Then the different symbols of a renouncer. In our day-to-day life, we have seen people who have renounced their life. We can make out with their lifestyle the various symbols of the renouncer, such as matted hair, nakedness or the wearing of an animal skin, the breaking of food taboos, celibacy and the discarding of all possessions ran counter to social obligations. Distinctions of food, dressing and lifestyle brought out the inherent tendencies of the renunciatory traditions. They also have different approaches towards the state and its officials. We even find dissent within dissent, thus commenting or confirming the Indian tradition of debate, questioning and argumenting or the Shastrarthas. The break with society and the anonymity of the new entrant into the fold were sought to be established by the taking of a new name. As a part of discussion for this slide, I would try to compare the Shaivite and the Vaishnavite traditions. We all are aware of Shiv and Vishnu as prominent deities of our present-day religious culture, but if you try to minutely observe the way Shiv is worshipped or the way Vishnu is worshipped, you can make out the difference. Vishnu worship is more or less associated with a settled life where cooked food can be served to the deity. Similarly, when we talk of Shaiv worship or worshipping Shiv, we find that most of the things which are offered to the deity are uncooked. Raw milk, for example, similarly fruits which are grown in the wild, and most of the things which we find in the wild which are not domesticated variety. For example, the flax or bhang, dhatur, which we are all aware of, these fruits are basically offered to Shiv. Similarly, we find dry fruits are offered, while when we talk of Vishnu, cooked foods are offered. So in this way, we can discuss how a renouncer can be seen. Shiv, for example, is the greatest renouncer of this entire mythology, which has been on the basis of which our society functions, or on the basis of which our society has been explained since times immemorial. We are not talking of the historicity of these religious established norms, but we are just taking an example from there. Similarly, we find that the renouncer gives up all family folds, doesn't get associated with anything. Most of the times the person renounces his old name as well. This is another aspect of this symbolism. Then sometimes we find that the renouncer is treated as an object of fear by the society. People feel that the renouncer can change the established norms or can be a threat to the norm. Such situations can be seen even today as well. When we see our families, when we see extended families or joint families, we find that people with a different approach or a different idea are normally taken as a threat. we try to bring them back into the social fold. But that distinction of the idea is something quite interesting here. So here I would focus that how having a distinct idea or an idea which others don't subscribe to can be taken as a social fear. The aim and objective of dissent often leads to renunciation. So this dissent or non-conformity to the established norms can be connected to the social fear. There also seems to be a social fear that extreme ideas would disturb the existing social order. The negation of family as a basic unit of society is evident from the opposition to the grihastha status and especially the insistence on celibacy. Here again I would take the example of Shiv. If we remember, our Puranic mythologies mention that Shiv was rejected as a bridegroom for Parvati at the first chance. So that episode can again be talked of here in a historical sense, why Parvati's mother Maina rejects Shiv as the husband of her daughter. The ideas were same. Shiv was taken as a person who had renounced, who was not conforming to the social norms of the days, who was not dressed like the normal groom. Now we talk of the patterns of renunciation. Not all the early renouncers chose to remain in isolation. Some among them returned to the margins of society and became the familiar mendicant wanderers, the parivrajakas, people who wander from place to place. You find different levels of growth in towns and rural hinterlands. Earliest monasteries seem to be strategically placed on major trade routes or in the vicinity of towns for reaching out to the source of alms and donations. However, such patterns cannot be seen in the case of individual renouncers. These patterns are again quite interesting. Say for example Buddhist monasteries or Jain monasteries, where we find that renunciants have actually got an organization. They are living a corporate life, which may not be corporate in present sense, but still in those days it was like a community living. Then we find individuals who have renounced the world who are not associated with this community living. So thus we can talk of different patterns of a renunciant's life. Renunciation, a historical trajectory. When we talk of entire Indian history, particularly the ancient Indian period, we find that the first stage is the Stone Age. The unsettled life of Stone Ages can hardly be compared with renunciatory practices. The basic argument seems that the norms had not yet been established, which could be renounced. The cave paintings reveal an inquisitive nature of that society and an altogether different perspective, where it is very difficult to find out any renunciatory traditions apparently. The Neolithic developments can be seen as efforts towards the establishments of norms which could be renounced later in time. Here I am emphasizing on agriculture as a practice which these renouncers actually challenged. The Harappan case of Shiv Pashupati seal has often led scholars to look for yogic practices during the Bronze Age. Irrespective of the nuances associated with the above mentioned seal and the priest king, one cannot say whether they had any renunciatory practice prevalent in their social structure. Still, we do find that such traditions were actually prevalent in the contemporary Harappan society. Scholars like Rumla Thapar, while connecting migrations to sizable social surplus, explain why renunciation is generally absent in Rigvedic traditions, while quite popular in the more complex society of the later Vedic period. And here in this context again, the Gangetic Valley, where agriculture had been practiced extensively, becomes the major hub where major renunciatory traditions come up. Jainism and Buddhism, along with many other similar yet distinct ideas, are closer to the renunciatory traditions. The dominant Brahmanical setup, which was the norm of the period. After the mid-first millennium CE, when the sects associated with heterodox religions were on the wane in northern India, there appears to have occurred the spectacular rise of Shaiva monasticism, especially in the peninsular parts of the subcontinent. Vaishnavism at this stage did not encourage monasticism. And here again I would like to take the example of Vishnu as a deity or as a social norm. It has been argued that Vaishnavism subsumed yoga into the bhakti tradition, when Gita speaks of yoga as the highest way and the true yogi as being one who does not detach himself from society but takes on the sufferings of others. Some prominent renunciatory traditions, these are all factual information and we need to emphasize on these as well. Jainism, Buddhism and Ajivik were some prominent traditions along with many others. The Ajivik sect, for example, seems to have been quite old, as there are allusions to predecessors of Makhali Goshal, its most important leader. Apart from Goshal, Buddhist tradition also connects the Ajivik doctrines with Puran Kashyap and Pakhur Kachayan. Puran Kashyap was a teacher who rejected the distinction between moral and immoral and denied that actions had consequences. He taught that good actions like liberality, self-control and honesty did not lead to the accumulation of any merit, and that deeds like killing, stealing and lying were not sinful. Ajit Kesh Kambalin, another great scholar of his age, he taught a materialist doctrine. According to him, actions earned either merit or nor demerit. The body returned to the elements after death and there was no rebirth. The materialist aspect of his doctrine connects him to the later Charvak school. Pakhur Kachayan taught that the elements such as earth, water, fire and air, as well as happiness, sorrow and life are fixed and unchanging and do not affect each other. Human action affects nothing. Even if a man were to cut off someone's head with a sharp knife, he would not take his life because the thrust of the sword would simply pass between the 7 elements. Sanjay Belathiput is described as someone who refused to say anything definite about anything, earning the label of a person who wriggled about like an eel. Now, before concluding, I would like to say something over all these traditions of renunciation. For example, Pakhur Kachayan, or for example, Sanjay Belathiput. These people can be taken as those individuals who challenge the norms of society. In the next lecture, we will be discussing Jainism and Buddhism, and we generally feel that Jainism Buddhism was a major challenge to the Brahmanic orthodoxy. But we can also look at that aspect why Jainism Buddhism gets popularity first of all. Why society was open to these ideas? What were the reasons? So here we will find our answer that why renunciation became a norm of society rather than taking it as a challenge to the society. Similarly, we talk of Charvak philosophy. Charvak philosophy is centered on simple materialistic gains of life or pleasures of life, and certain Prakrit verses are associated with that. For example, Charvak philosophy says, Yavat jivet, sukham jivet, rinam kritva, ghritam pibet. And the literal translation says that till you are alive, you should lead a life of luxury. Whatever you wish to do, you should do. Even if you feel like drinking ghee, then too, and you don't have money, then too you can borrow it from someone, purchase the ghee, and then also satisfy your thirst. It's same Charvak philosophy which can be connected to later materialistic philosophies or the Lokayat philosophy. Now, the point which we should be discussing is that why a tradition says that do not conform to the norms. What would the norms of society, what the norms of the society would say actually, that control your desires. If you don't have money, don't have such desires. Lead a life of spirituality, morality, etc. But here we find an individual saying that there is no harm in having a desire. Even if you have a desire, you cannot satisfy your quench or your thirst. You can borrow money. I am emphasizing on this idea of borrowing money, which is against the ethics where they say earn that money. Then he says that with that borrowed money you can purchase that particular thing and then satisfy yourself. So here we can say that such were the norms of renunciation, where we find that even individuals gave ideas to the society that you can challenge the established norms. They are not a taboo, they are not something rigid, they are not something fixed. It's the same society which we generally associate with spirituality or intense spirituality, which in today's context we say Adhyatma. Don't we find it's quite interesting to find similar ideas where we talk of Kautilya's Arthashastra as a text of statecraft, or Vatsyayan's Kam Sutra as a text on erotics, or where Gita philosophy. Then, as far as conclusion is concerned, we can say that renunciation can be talked of as a counterculture. Renunciation can be an integrating factor when we talk of social aspects. Renunciation can be freedom of expression. Renunciation can be used as a mechanism of carrying forward the older traditions, and renunciation can be used as a sense in the present times to use past to have a better future. Now, these are certain reading lists which I would like the students to go through. They are quite detailed, but they have lots of interesting things to tell you. Besides these, there are certain very good books which are generally recommended in any good university's reading list. So you can go through these texts, and I hope the discussion was quite helpful for the class. Thank you. Hello students, in this session we'll be talking of Jainism and Buddhism, and we'll try to make a comparative study of these early Indian traditions. So Jainism and Buddhism are two major religious trends in our country. Generally speaking, we take Jainism and Buddhism as new religions, but when they started, they were not religions in their own right. They were actually a challenge to the Brahmanic orthodoxy or the Hindu religion which we say today. But over the period of time, we find that they got merged into the dominant or the traditional religious trend which we today call Hinduism. So when they started, they were actually diverse from Brahmanic religion. And as Brahmanic religion matured, we find that both Jainism and Buddhism came and fully got amalgamated into this tradition. So the objective of this lecture is to discuss what Jainism Buddhism was all about. As far as sources are concerned, primary sources are those literary texts which were composed in Pali Prakrit, and they relate to these two religious traditions. As far as secondary literature is concerned, we have taken help from most of the texts which actually speak of Jainism Buddhism in the later years, and then certain secondary research books by different scholars. You will get to know about them in the extended bibliography which we have provided at the end of the session. As far as geographical provenance is concerned, Brahmanism had its stronghold in the Gangetic Valley. Similarly, Buddhism, Jainism also found expression into the same geographic land, but slightly east to the Brahmanic stronghold. Gradually, they spread over the entire Indian subcontinent. As far as methodology is concerned, we have tried to emphasize more upon the popular traditions as well as the historical narratives. We have taken help from inscriptional material as well as the literary traditions which we find enshrined in different books. So let's begin the discussion. I hope you learned something new from here as well. The socio-economic life in pre-Mauryan period was actually quite diverse and quite distinct the way we have Vedic period. It was the age of Dharma Sutras, where we find Varna obligations coming to light. There was a general supremacy of Brahmanas and Kshatriyas. Exploitation of lower Varnas were also there, and we find that even women were an object of exploitation only. It was also the age of philosophical books such as the Upanishads. Interestingly, all these Upanishads, or a major chunk of them or a major section of Upanishads were compiled and composed by the leading Kshatriyas of those days. Then we find this was also the age of social frustrations. Social frustration in the sense like we have got Vaishya and Shudra classes which are generally mentioned in the later Vedic traditions. These classes actually acquired economic mobility, while social mobility didn't come to them on account of the Brahmanic dominance. So these social frustrations can be connected to Jainism and Buddhism. This was also the age of elaborate rituals and sacrifices where the Brahmin priests had an upper hand. So since this lecture series relates to religion, society and culture in Indian history, so in the same continuation we'll look at Jain and Buddhist traditions. There has to be certain traditions or certain causes for the rise of any particular historical event. So here also we have got some events, some reasons for those events. For example, intellectual revolution. The 6th century BCE transition which happens in Indian historical traditions would actually be known as historical or intellectual revolution, where a large number of people start changing or challenging the existing Vedic norms of religious policy. We have got more than 360 orders of philosophical thought, more than 62 philosophers are mentioned in contemporary literature, and there is a strong Varna hierarchy. Agricultural economy, which was becoming prominent during 6th century BCE, where we find agriculture being practiced by a large section of the population. Animal sacrifice was generally frowned upon. Urbanization and trading activities added to the economic status of the Vaishyas, who desired social mobility as well. There were increasing social inequalities due to the rise of new kingdoms and urban centers. Now let's discuss these factors one by one. When we talk of intellectual revolution or philosophers or philosophical thought, I mean to say that the different philosophies which emerged in 6th century BCE were actually not in conformation to the later Vedic context or later Vedic literary traditions. We find that these were the age where people were questioning the Vedic norms, people were not happy with these Vedic rituals or ritual-based religious practice, that's why the idea of challenge comes up. And as in the previous lecture where we discussed renunciatory traditions, we'll connect the same thing here in context of Jainism and Buddhism. Then we find that Varna hierarchies were more or less fossilized. By Varna hierarchies being fossilized, I mean to say that a son of a Brahmin was supposed to become a Brahmin, while the son of a Shudra was supposed to be a Shudra. They couldn't change their Varna identities. So the idea of having a Varna, which was initially based on occupation, the word Varn in itself means color. So gradually it gets fossilized. So obviously in the long run it will lead to social frustration. For example, if we today make mandatory that son of a teacher will become a teacher, son of a doctor will become a doctor, similarly son of a politician will become a politician, it sounds quite convenient, but in the long run it may not be convenient for the person concerned. Then we find that agricultural economy comes up in this period. If we are aware of historical traditions, we find that around 6th century BCE, society, particularly North Indian society, in Gangetic Valley, was showing great trends towards agriculture. We find that agricultural activities increased. No doubt agriculture was into practice in this age right since late Neolithic, but during this period we find extensive paddy cultivation being done, where intensive labor was involved, large scale clearing of forests were done. So with these agricultural practices, we find that social norms were also changing as far as diet or animal sacrifices are concerned. One interesting thing I would like to point is that the Vedic religion more or less involved animal sacrifices. As agriculture became popular, we should not only emphasize that animals are helpful in agricultural activities, that's why they should not be sacrificed. I would like to emphasize that even dietary habits change because of the climate and temperature variations. If you are aware, Gangetic Valley has slightly higher temperature than the colder climates. And if people are practicing active agriculture in such higher temperatures, the protein intake should be analyzed. Then the digestibility of the food which they are taking should also be analyzed. And in the light of all these understandings, we should try to bring out the reason why people were turning towards vegetarianism. Was it out of compulsion, or was it the requirement of the times? Was it by choice, or was religion dictating that? So because of late we find that even Vaishnav traditions or even Jain Buddhist traditions, they become quite rigid with non-vegetarianism, or when it comes to prescribing vegetarian diet. Here I would just try to provide an answer to this, that actually it was the changing climatic conditions or the changing lifestyle which was promoting vegetarianism. Otherwise we cannot have a simple clear-cut explanation that since animals are being used in agriculture, they should not be sacrificed. Similarly, here in this slide we have talked of increasing urbanization. 6th century BC is known as the phase of second urbanization in Indian history. It's also the age of the establishment of state society, the 16 Mahajanpadas which we generally talk of in this period. So as the states come up, the society automatically becomes hierarchized, different categories of officers come up. So this change in socio-economic hierarchy were also factors of social frustration. Let's begin with Buddhism. Buddha, and the two traditions of Buddhism, Hinayana and Mahayana. When we analyze all the three ideas, we find quite interesting patterns emerging from this Buddhist traditions. There were 5 major events of Buddha's life and their symbols. Here I will not discuss the early life of Buddha because most of us are aware of that, so we should not be fascinated by Buddha's life. The teachings of Buddha are far more important than the personal life which Buddha had. The birth of Buddha is actually represented by a lotus symbol, bull, and at times with a white elephant. The renunciation of Buddha, if you remember, last section was about renunciation. This renunciation has been represented by a horse, a symbol of mobility. Enlightenment of Buddha is represented by the Bodhi tree under which Buddha gained enlightenment, and the first sermon by a spoked wheel, which is known as Dharma Chakra Pravartan. Then the death of Buddha is generally symbolized through a stupa. This symbolic representation of Buddha became very popular with Hinayana traditions and not with Mahayana traditions. Mahayana tradition of Buddhism continued to portray Buddha in human form through different statues, images, etc. Buddhism had the concept of four noble truths, Arya Satya. These are also known as Chatur Arya Satya. And the teachings are quite simple. Buddha says this world is full of sorrows. The prime cause of this sorrow is desire. This sorrow can be cured by controlling the desires. The desires can be controlled by following the Eightfold Path. Now, if you analyze these four teachings, you'll find that Buddha didn't say anything new. All the teachings were quite easy, or they would have already been prevalent in the society. As students of history, our primary concern should be to connect these teachings with the contemporary social practices. Buddha says this world is full of misery. So what could be the cause of this misery? Was misery not there before Buddha tells about this misery? Or was misery not there after Buddha gives the idea of Buddhism? Obviously, misery was always there in life. So why it becomes quite catchy or quite interesting, or why Buddha overemphasizes upon these aspects should be our concern here. Similarly, Buddha says that the prime cause of this misery is our greed or desire, and this greed can be controlled by following the Eightfold Path. So here in this discussion, I would like to say that here desire or greed could be connected with the quest for achievement or attainment of more and more material gains. Since this was the age of agricultural expansion, social hierarchies would be changing, and in this changed hierarchic norms, we find that certain sections of society would be adding to its material prosperity at the cost of the others. So in this context, Buddha would be saying that this world is full of misery. In short, the competition which this new economic activity would be bringing into society prompted Buddha to brand it as a world full of misery. Then the Eightfold Path, which is known as the Ashtangic Marg, it's again quite easy or quite easily explained by Buddha. It says right understanding, right thought, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, right concentration, etc. In all these teachings, there is nothing which was quite difficult for the laity or the layman to follow. The teachings are quite simple. Buddha basically says that follow what is right. So in short, it can be spoken of as the middle path. There were three pillars of Buddhism: Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha. The enlightened one, Buddha; the Dhamma, the doctrine; and Sangha, the order. So this was a new community-like development coming within the fold of Buddhism, where the renunciatory traditions of earlier times were being given a corporate look through the Sangha and having a disciplined lifestyle. Then there were four Buddhist councils. Their purpose was to settle disputes, provide answers to the new set of questions which arose, and to ensure that the order of Buddhism continues to satisfy the spiritual quest of the laity. As far as settling disputes is concerned, I would say that disputes or debates are like spices of life. We cannot get rid of them. Disputes mean that the idea is gaining popularity. So if dispute comes up, or if some dissent comes up, obviously the idea has attained certain social respect or some social value. That's why people are questioning that idea. So there were four Buddhist Sanghas, four Buddhist councils basically, known as Sangitis. In these councils, the various groups which were having problems or which required explanations for Buddhist teachings, they discussed, elaborated upon it, and we find that at times schisms also happened. Schisms means partitions or divisions of the same Buddhist community happens, but in the long run we find that all these discourses enriched the Buddhist doctrine beyond all explanations. Then in these slides I have got the details of the four Buddhist councils. The first Buddhist council, we find that the first two treatises of Buddhism like Sutta Pitaka and Vinaya Pitaka were composed. In the second Buddhist council, we find that division happens in Buddhist Sangha into the orthodox Thavirvadin or Theravadins and the unorthodox Mahasanghikas. The third Buddhist council, which was held during the rule of Ashoka, we find that the orthodox Thavirvadins declared as true followers, and there was a composition of Abhidhamma Pitaka, the philosophical details of Buddhism. Then the fourth Buddhist council is held under the patronage of King Kanishk, and in this we find that Buddhism gets divided into Mahayana and Hinayan Buddhism. And these two traditions of Buddhism spread to different parts of the world. Interestingly, one very strange thing happens with the Buddhist councils and Ashoka's association with it. We find that Buddhism, which emerged with a very simple training or with a very simple teaching. If you remember in the previous slides, we said that Buddha says this world is full of misery. With such a simple teaching, over certain generations or certain decades, we find that finally they require a text like Abhidhamma Pitak, which tries to explain the philosophies inherent in Buddhist teachings. So don't you feel this is quite interesting and strange? The follower which were happy with a simple teaching of Buddha now requires philosophical explanations for that. So that's the maturity of an idea. Ideas are always simple. The more they are debated, the more philosophical they become. And whatever great philosophies you come across, if you try to reach the root level, the grassroots level of that philosophy, you'll find that the basic idea was a very, very simple one. Then we come to Jainism. In this lecture series, we'll try to cover Buddhism and Jainism both. So, we have tried to divide our time equally over both the discussions. Before I begin Jainism, I would like to say that as far as popularity is concerned, Buddhism became quite popular with the masses than Jainism. Basic problem area, according to me, lies in the teachings which Jainism had. Jainism overemphasized on truth, non-violence and other features. Similarly, Jainism emphasized on brahmacharya, while when it came to Buddhism, Buddha's similar teaching was to have a middle path, moderation. So I think that would have been the reason why Buddhism gets quite popularized. Interestingly, despite having a great or a huge popularity, Buddhism declines in Indian case, while Jainism continues to have certain ground here. This decline can be connected to the loss of royal patronage which Buddhism had enjoyed for several generations, and all of a sudden that patronage wanes down. While when we talk of Jainism, it had very less royal patronage. It was patronized mostly by the merchant community, traders. So there was no case of that royal patronage declining with certain political turmoils, and in the longer run Jainism continued to survive. In present scenario, we cannot distinguish Buddhists, Jains from a practicing Hindu. Actually, the term practicing Hindu is a problematic term. Just for our convenience, we are using it. Otherwise, Hinduism is an umbrella term. In historical sense, it's better if we use the term Brahmanic religion. So in present times, when we talk of Brahmanic religion, we find that we cannot remove the traits of Jainism, Buddhism, or we cannot segregate the followers of Jainism, Buddhism and Brahmanism right now. So thus we find that the ideas which were a challenge to Brahmanism in the long run became part and parcel of the same dominant philosophy of Brahmanism. There were 5 cardinal principles of Jainism: Ahimsa, that is non-violence; Satya, that is truth; Asteya, non-stealing; Aparigraha, that is no property or attachments; and Brahmacharya, celibacy. It's interesting that the followers of Jainism were advised to eat in their palms so that they don't have any extra morsel and they don't get attached to it. Such was the level of idealism which Jainism popularized. There were 3 gems of Jainism known as Ratnatraya: knowledge, action and liberation. These could be actually compared to the Buddhist philosophies, simplistic Buddhist philosophies. Then just like Buddhism, there were 2 famous popular Jain councils in Jain history, and in both the councils we find that Shwetambar Jains or the white clad Jains became popular. In the first Jain council we find that there was a division of Jainism into Digambaras, sky clad, and Shwetambaras, that is white clad. There were compilation of 12 Angas to replace the 14 Purvas. These 14 Purvas were lost during the famous famine in Magad towards the later parts of Chandragupta Maurya's rule, and these literary developments which happened in the first Jain council were actually accepted only by the Shwetambaras. Interestingly, Digambaras were that sect of Jainism who went along with Chandragupta Maurya to deep south when he abdicated the throne. And once they came back to Magad after the famine ended, they found that the followers of Jainism who had resided in Magad, they had started using a white cloth to cover their body. So on this idea, that debate arose that who were the real followers, and then schism happens and Jainism gets divided into 2 sects. Then the second Jain council was held after several centuries in the 6th century CE, somewhere around 512 CE, at a place known as Vallabhi in Gujarat, and it was attended only by the Shwetambaras. There was a final compilation of the 12 Angas and 12 Upangas. Now we head towards the conclusionary note. Here I would like to tell you a short story. Mahavir, for example, had a large follower population. Both Buddha and Mahavir came from the ruling families of those times. Both of them were Kshatriyas. But when it came to connecting with the masses, the Jatak stories say that Buddha could connect easily with the masses. There is a nice story that there was a widowed woman who lost her only son, and she was running from pillar to post. She was trying to bring back the son to life. She could not realize, or she could not acknowledge the fact that the son is no more in the world. She met Buddha in one of the discourses, and Buddha, instead of telling her that this is the reality of life, son is dead, son will not come back to life, gives her an exercise. Buddha says that you visit any home where no one has died ever. So you bring some water or some rice from there, and I'll bring your son back to life. So the woman is so hopeful that she runs from house to house in her village. She goes beyond that village, crosses several villages in her quest to find a family or a house where no one has ever died. So finally she finds that there is no such family. Everywhere someone or the other has died, and then ultimately the truth dawns upon her. So here I would like to emphasize that instead of telling her directly that the son will not come back to life, what Buddha does, Buddha makes her find out the realities of life through her own quest. I think that was quite significant in making Buddhism popular, where people were given ample chance of practicing what they want to and having their own methods. While in the case of Jainism, we find very little such evidences. Then similarly, one more story is there. Buddha was sitting with his followers, and some people came and started abusing him, saying not very happy things about him. Buddha never responded. So his followers asked that why is he quiet? Why is he not responding to all the falsehood? And he says that if someone offers some gift to someone and the person refuses to accept the gift, with whom does the gift lie? Then the followers say that obviously with the person who is offering the gift. So here Mahavir says that all the gifts which he is offering me through abuses, I do not receive them. Thus all the abuses lie with the person who is actually abusing. So with these two simplistic stories, I would like to say that these were the reasons why Buddhism could become popular amongst the masses. The idea of a middle path, the idea of righteousness, the idea of having a life free from vices would made it quite popular. While when it came to Jainism, at times they became quite extreme. For example, Mahavir says that we should not harm any living being, and that's why even agriculture was prohibited by the practitioners. He says that even while doing agriculture, life gets hampered. Similarly, they had an idea of covering the mouth while speaking so that they don't harm any living creature. There were so many interesting aspects associated with it. And one last thing which I would like to quote here is that Jain basadis were quite popular during medieval period. In one of the Jain basadi, one foreign traveler came carrying a microscope. So the Jain priest over there was actually preaching on vegetarianism and non-vegetarianism, and was trying to convince the foreigner that people should be having a vegetarian diet. So at that same moment, he got his curd brought, served as his lunch. So that person, with the help of microscope, the foreigner, tried to prove that there are certain living beings in that curd as well. So thus we can say that different traditions have different backgrounds, and how people react to them again plays a very crucial role in popularizing them. Now when we talk of conclusion, we can say that Buddhism and Jainism had certain points of comparison, certain similarities but certain inherent dissimilarities. The middle path of Buddhism versus Syadvad of Jainism. Jainism gave a very good philosophy known as Syadvad, means relativism. Like nothing is true or nothing is false. Everything is relatively true or relatively false. Similarly, there were different causes of rise, popularity, decline and revival. Interestingly, the Buddhism which we find today is quite distinct from what Buddha preached. Then the lessons for the present. As we all know that history repeats itself, but we fail to learn from history. That's why I've added this line here, that we should learn some lessons from Jainism and Buddhism, controlling our needs or having a control over our desires. Then this is an extended reading list which I have provided for your help. So thank you, class.
Sir, since we have been talking about Jainism and Buddhism, would you elaborate on this comparison between Syadvad of Jainism and middle path of Buddhism. Can you elucidate it further? Can you just talk about it?
My understanding says that Buddha gave ample scope to the follower, that the person can decide upon the middle path. What is the average? Neither the extreme indulgences nor extreme penances. So somewhere the middle path, contentment. While the Syadvad of Jainism says that everything is relatively true. Like we should not be rigid with truth or rigid with falsehood. The basic idea says that the Syad concept, like maybe, relatively, that maybe the thing is true or maybe the thing is false, means like if you are talking of a particular aspect of life, that we should compare it with some other event, some other aspect, and then moderation will automatically set in.
Sir, you have discussed that Buddhism of today is different from Buddhism what Buddha preached. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, that's very interesting question. When we talk of iconography in Indian history, like the idea of making statues and sculptures, Buddha Buddha starts this idea against Brahmanic orthodoxy, ritualism, sacrifices, etc. But in Indian history, the first statues to be made were of Buddha himself in Gandhar and Mathura School of Art. So I was speaking in that sense. Similarly, when we see Buddhist practices today, we find lots of ritualism in them, like having flag posts, burning incense sticks, rosary beads, chanting mantras, etc. So these are certain practices which were popular into Brahmanic religious traditions. And in the longer run, Buddhist traditions also appropriated the same practices to gain popularity, I would say.
Okay. So dear friends, on that note, we would like to thank Mr. Kumar for coming to our show and delivering this wonderful lecture. And thank you, dear friends, for watching our show. Stay tuned and keep watching. Thank you.
Thank you.